Ellesmere Island, the high Arctic. A winter night in the 1920s. No sun had risen in weeks, and none would for weeks more. Constable James Whitlock stood outside the detachment's single wooden building, the nearest town some 700 miles south, and listened to nothing at all. No engine, no voice, no dog bark carried on the wind. His partner had left 6 weeks earlier on a coastal sovereignty patrol and was not due back for 2 more months. The supply ship that reached posts like this one came, if the ice allowed it, once a year. Some years it did not come at all. Whitlock was not waiting for anything that particular night. There was nothing to wait for. He was simply enduring it, the way the men posted to these small, high Arctic outposts learned to. One lamp lit against the dark. One stove fed through the night so the pipes would not crack. One long watch kept for no one but himself. Somewhere south of him, in Ottawa, a map showed a small red mark with his detachment's name beside it, proof that Canada held this ground. The map did not show what holding it actually required, or how long a single winter night out here could feel when it lasted for months rather than hours. Closing question. What did the RCMP actually ask of a man posted this far from anyone, and why did the government need him there at all? Before you can understand why a man like Whitlock was there at all, you need to understand what these postings were actually for. Other nations had also eyed the Arctic islands north of the mainland, and in 1921, the federal government created the Eastern Arctic Patrol to establish an unmistakable Canadian presence there. Customs, immigration, game law, and a post office, all carried north once a year aboard a single government ship. The RCMP opened its first high Arctic detachment at Craig Harbour, Ellesmere Island, in 1922, with 6 men that first winter. Dundas Harbour followed on Devon Island in 1924, staffed by 2 constables, Bache Peninsula in 1926, with only 2 or 3 officers at a time. Its post office reached by ship just 3 times in 7 years, before the rival claim to the region was resolved, and the post closed in 1933, judged too difficult to reach reliably. The islands themselves held little the government particularly valued, beyond the claim itself. A scattering of muskox and peary caribou, seal and narwhal in open water during the brief summer, and almost no permanent population at all. These postings produced their own quiet reputations regardless. Constable A.H. Joy became known across the force for patrols that ran for months at a stretch, hundreds of miles at a stride. Other young men posted to the very same handful of buildings did not survive the assignment at all. The RCMP's presence on this ground was never a large operation. It was a few buildings, a few men, and a flag. And for years, that was the entire, visible weight of a national claim. Before we go on, if this kind of quiet, careful history is what you come here for, consider subscribing. This channel follows the old Canadian patrols one story at a time, without embellishment. What a winter alone on Ellesmere Island taught a young constable about simply enduring is something no supply ship, arriving once a year if the ice allowed it, was ever built to carry for him. If you or your family served, or grew up hearing the stories of the RCMP's Arctic detachments, tell us what you remember in the comments. Next time, the Eastern Arctic patrol ship that reached some of these posts only once a year, and the mail that once took 2 years to be answered. Closing question. What did it actually take to keep a 2 or 3 man post like this running for a full year on one ship's visit? And what happened when something went wrong in the 11 months it did not come? Daily life at a post like this ran on small, exact routines. The dogs fed and checked for frostbite on their paws. The stove tended through the night so the pipes would not freeze. The weather and the state of the sea ice logged in a book whether or not anyone in Ottawa would ever read the entry. Twice a year, in spring and again in autumn, the real work began. Patrols by dog sled that could run for weeks, sometimes months, covering hundreds of miles along the coast, to visit trapping families, take a rough census, enforce game law, and simply be seen. Because in a sovereignty post, being seen was half the job. A man learned what 40 degrees below zero did to exposed skin in under a minute. He learned to read a sky before it read him. The particular color a coming storm turned the horizon. The sound sea ice made in the last hour before it moved beneath a sled. He learned all of it because no one else was coming to teach him twice, and because the nearest doctor, if something went badly wrong out there, was further away than the whole of his patrol route. The dog team was the entire transportation system, and keeping one alive through an Arctic winter was its own daily discipline. A working team ran 8 to 12 dogs, fed on frozen fish or seal meat hauled in by the ton each summer before the ice closed the harbor, harnessed in fan formation across open sea ice or in single file through timber and river country further south. A sled runner iced wrong could slow a week's travel to a crawl. A dog gone lame 2 days from the nearest shelter was a decision a constable had to make alone, with no one to consult and no way to ask. There was no other method that could cover this ground in winter darkness, and for the length of this channel's period, nothing replaced it. Much of what a constable actually did on these patrols was quiet administration too, checking a trapper's license, logging furs traded through the nearest Hudson's Bay Company post, noting who had wintered where. On paper, back at headquarters, it read like routine bookkeeping. In practice, it was often the only regular contact some families had with any outside authority in a given year. Closing question. What happened to a patrol when that hard-won cold-weather knowledge wasn't there yet? When the men making the trip hadn't learned it the hard way, but were about to? Before you can understand why every Arctic patrol after 1911 carried an Indigenous guide, you need to understand what happened without one. In December 1910, Inspector Francis Fitzgerald and 3 men left Fort McPherson for Dawson City, an 800-kilometer run, with 15 dogs and 30 days of food, guided by a recently retired constable who had made the route only once, and only in the other direction. By family account, an experienced Métis guide named Louis Cardinal had asked the patrol to wait for him before setting out. They did not wait. By mid-January, they were lost, unable to find the creek that would lead them to Dawson, and turned back. By the 19th, they had begun eating the dogs. Fitzgerald's last diary entry is dated February 5th. All 4 men died within days of it, 40 kilometers from the post they had left 7 weeks earlier. A search party of 4 men under Corporal William Dempster, who knew the route from years of experience, left Dawson on February 28th and found the frozen bodies 3 weeks later, on the very trail the patrol had doubled back along in its last desperate push for home. They were buried together at Fort McPherson on March 28, 1911. After what came to be known as the Lost Patrol, the force made an Indigenous guide mandatory on every northern patrol, established cabins and food caches along the route, and marked the trail itself so it could not be lost the same way again. It was a lesson paid for once, in full, so that it would not have to be paid for twice. More than a century later, the detachment at Fort McPherson still tends their memorial every year. Closing question. What did the force actually learn from the Lost Patrol, about whose knowledge of the North it could not do without? The RCMP's Arctic operations depended, plainly and completely, on Inuit, Inuvialuit, Gwich'in, and Greenlandic Special Constables, men whose knowledge of ice, weather, and travel the force did not have and could not have learned in time on its own. Guides like Nukapingwak were spoken of as among the finest in the North. At the RCMP's very first Ellesmere Island post, an Inuit Special Constable named Kakto arrived from Pond Inlet with his wife, Uarlu, and their 2 children, who both died within a few months of reaching the station. What Special Constables taught went well beyond simply finding the way. It was how to build a snow shelter that would hold heat through a night at 50 below, how to read the particular gray of ice that would carry a sled's weight and the gray that would not, how to hunt seal at a breathing hole for dog food when the post's own supplies ran short months before the next ship. None of it appeared in any RCMP training manual issued from Regina or Ottawa. Special constables were chosen for exactly this: the ability to speak some English, to hunt reliably enough to feed a post through the winter, and the willingness to leave their own communities for a posting that offered little in return beyond a modest wage and the force's plain dependence on them. This channel will not soften the rest of the record either. RCMP fingerprinting of Inuit began in 1932. In 1934, the force played a direct administrative role in relocating Inuit families to Dundas Harbour under Hudson's Bay Company control, a resettlement that left them without adequate shelter through a hard winter. By 1935, a government medical examiner had even proposed identifying Inuit by numbered disc rather than by name. All of it belongs to the same institution, often in the very same years, sometimes involving the very men whose guiding skill was the only thing that had kept an RCMP patrol alive at all. Closing question. What did it mean, for both sides, that the RCMP's survival in the Arctic depended on a partnership the force itself, in other decisions, treated with so little regard? In July 1931, a quiet, powerfully built stranger walked into Fort McPherson, bought several hundred rounds of ammunition and other supplies, and gave his name as Albert Johnson. Constable Edgar Millen questioned him and learned almost nothing, not where he had come from, not why a man living alone in the bush carried so much cash. By Christmas, Gwich'in trappers were complaining that Johnson was interfering with their trapline sets and threatening anyone who came near his cabin on the Rat River. On December 26th, Constable Alfred King and a special constable were turned away from the cabin without a word spoken. They returned 5 days later with a search warrant and reinforcements. Johnson answered them with gunfire, seriously wounding King. A larger party of 9 men returned on January 9th with 40 pounds of dynamite. Even a charge thrown onto the cabin roof did not force him out. He had dug a firing pit beneath the ruins and kept shooting from it through a 15-hour siege in temperatures near -40. When a larger force returned on January 14th to press the siege further, they found the cabin empty. Johnson had slipped away on foot into open country days earlier, carrying only what he could run with. In the entire length of the manhunt that followed, not one man ever heard Johnson speak. Closing question. What was it about this one man that turned a routine trapline complaint into the largest manhunt the North had ever seen? Johnson slipped away from the ruined cabin and vanished into country few men could have crossed on foot. On January 30th, cornered in a thicket along the Rat River, he shot and killed Constable Edgar Millen and disappeared again. By then, the manhunt was being followed by radio audiences across the continent, an early taste of a kind of national attention the North had never drawn before. For the first time in RCMP history, the force requested an aircraft for a manhunt. Pilot Wilfred Wap May flew north from Edmonton, nearly 2,900 kilometers away, to ferry men and supplies and search the ground from above, while radio operators, also a first, reported positions back to Aklavik, across country that had never carried a signal before. May himself later described bucking snowstorms and hurricane-force headwinds so strong they blew his small aircraft backward over the ground, flying blind through blizzards that blotted out the earth beneath him. Johnson crossed a 7,000-foot mountain pass in a blizzard, reportedly wearing his snowshoes backward to confuse his trackers, and mingled his trail with a migrating caribou herd. On February 17th, 48 days and roughly 240 kilometers after it began, the posse cornered him on a bend of the frozen Eagle River. Johnson threw himself into the snow and opened fire. Special Constable John Moses fired the shot that ended it, and Staff Sergeant Earl Hersey was wounded in the same exchange. Searchers found more than $2,000 in cash on Johnson's body, along with gold. His real name was never established. The manhunt became legend almost immediately, followed live by radio audiences nationwide as it unfolded, and retold in books and films for decades afterward, the way only a handful of Canadian pursuits ever have been. Closing question. What does it say about the North itself that a man could vanish into it that completely, and never once be identified? Johnson slipped away from the ruined cabin and vanished into country few men could have crossed on foot. On January 30th, cornered in a thicket along the Rat River, he shot and killed Constable Edgar Millen and disappeared again. By then, the manhunt was being followed by radio audiences across the continent, an early taste of a kind of national attention the North had never drawn before. For the first time in RCMP history, the force requested an aircraft for a manhunt. Pilot Wilfred Wap May flew north from Edmonton, nearly 2,900 kilometers away, to ferry men and supplies and search the ground from above, while radio operators, also a first, reported positions back to Aklavik, across country that had never carried a signal before. May himself later described bucking snowstorms and hurricane-force headwinds so strong they blew his small aircraft backward over the ground, flying blind through blizzards that blotted out the earth beneath him. Johnson crossed a 7,000-foot mountain pass in a blizzard, reportedly wearing his snowshoes backward to confuse his trackers, and mingled his trail with a migrating caribou herd. On February 17th, 48 days and roughly 240 kilometers after it began, the posse cornered him on a bend of the frozen Eagle River. Johnson threw himself into the snow and opened fire. Special Constable John Moses fired the shot that ended it, and Staff Sergeant Earl Hersey was wounded in the same exchange. Searchers found more than $2,000 in cash on Johnson's body, along with gold. His real name was never established. The manhunt became legend almost immediately, followed live by radio audiences nationwide as it unfolded, and retold in books and films for decades afterward, the way only a handful of Canadian pursuits ever have been. Closing question. What does it say about the North itself that a man could vanish into it that completely and never once be identified? What did it actually mean then to hold a post like this for a year, 2 years, sometimes longer, on the strength of one ship's visit and one partner's company? It meant a kind of duty this channel does not think has ever been fully reckoned with. Not heroism in the way the word gets used for a single dramatic afternoon, but something slower and less visible. The willingness to simply remain, competently and without complaint, in a place that existed entirely on the fact that someone was willing to stay there. Many of these men went on afterward to unremarkable postings elsewhere in the force, married, raised families, and rarely spoke of the winters that came before. What they carried out of the Arctic mostly went home with them in silence, the way so much of that generation's hardest years did. By the 1950s, radio reached posts that had once heard nothing for months at a stretch, and an aircraft could resupply a detachment in a single afternoon where a dog team had once taken weeks. What Constable Whitlock's generation carried alone, the cold read correctly the first time, a guide's knowledge trusted completely and without question, the long dark endured without complaint, because no one was coming to relieve you early, simply was not required of the men who came after, not in the same way, not ever again. If this channel is going to keep documenting the old Canadian patrols, the men who kept them, and what it actually cost, subscribe. There are more posts, more patrols, more winters like this one, and most of them were never written down at all. What a winter alone on Ellesmere Island taught a young constable about simply enduring is something no supply ship, arriving once a year if the ice allowed it, was ever built to carry for him. If you or your family served, or grew up hearing the stories of the RCMP's Arctic detachments in this era, tell us what you remember in the comments. Next time, the Eastern Arctic patrol ship that reached some of these posts only once a year, and the mail that once took 2 years to be answered. Somewhere on Ellesmere Island, the building Whitlock stood beside is gone, or nearly gone, its timbers returned slowly to the gravel it stood on. The dark still comes there for months at a time, the same as it always did. It doesn't know anyone used to stand watch in it, and it never will. Rest well. Someone kept the watch.